Hey, Sociology Droids listeners, welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to be tackling some Karl Marx today.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically for you, a grad-level sociology student.
Right.
We're going to be looking at his approach to sociology.
Okay.
And we're drawing from some excerpts that you sent in. We've got Sociological Theory by Ritzer and Stepnisky.
Right.
And then also some Capital by Marx himself.
Yeah, it's really interesting to contrast Marx with some of the other kind of founding figures of sociology.
Okay.
So let's take Durkheim, for example.
Okay.
So, Durkheim was all about how these social facts out there
Right.
shape individual behavior.
Yeah.
But Marx was really laser focused on something different.
Right.
He was really interested in the inherent oppressiveness of capitalism.
So he wasn't just interested in analyzing societal disorder like a lot of the early sociologists were coming out of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution.
Yes. So
he was really looking to dismantle the system itself.
that's a really good point. And that's actually precisely why Marx's work wasn't really embraced by a lot of these early theorists. Because they were much more into the idea of reform and gradual change.
Yeah.
Marx was calling for a complete overhaul.
Yeah. Let's get to the heart of it then. Let's talk about capital.
Okay.
But Marx doesn't see it just as money.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not just money for Marx. He defines it as a social relation.
Okay.
So you have those who own the means of production. On the one hand, we call them the capitalists.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have those who really only have their labor to sell.
Right. The workers.
The workers, exactly. And this relationship, according to Marx, creates this inherent exploitation.
So it's not just a side effect. It's like a core feature of how capitalism functions.
Exactly. It's baked into the system.
Okay. And this isn't just an unequal distribution of wealth then?
Right.
This is about power dynamics.
Right.
Masked by these seemingly impersonal forces of the market.
Yeah, the market kind of makes it seem like this is all just natural and neutral.
Right.
But for Marx, there's all this stuff going on underneath the surface.
Okay. So to really understand how this works, we need to dive into Marx's ideas about commodities, money, and this whole cycle of capitalism.
This is where things get really interesting.
Okay, hit me with it.
All right, so let's start with how Marx analyzes commodities in Capital.
Okay.
He argues that they have a dual nature.
Okay.
They have what he calls use value, which is basically their practical function.
Okay.
And then they have exchange value,
okay,
which is their worth in trade.
So a coat, for example.
Yeah, a coat's a perfect one.
Its use value is to keep you warm.
Right.
But its exchange value might be a certain amount of linen or money or something like that.
Exactly. And it's this exchange value where things get a little tricky.
Okay.
Marx uses these concepts of relative and equivalent forms of value. So let's stick with our example of linen and a coat.
Oh.
When linen expresses its value in terms of the coat, it's taking the relative form.
Okay.
The coat, on the other hand,
by
representing the linen's value, embodies the equivalent form.
So the linen's kind of actively expressing its value.
Yes.
And the coat is kind of passively providing the measure.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay. Why can't linen just express its value in more linen?
That's a great question. The problem is that would just be quantity, not value.
Okay.
To express value, you need a different commodity to measure against.
Got it. So the coat provides that measure for the linen.
Right.
But then how does money fit into all of this?
Okay, so money enters as this kind of universal equivalent.
Okay.
It starts as a measure of value, like we were just talking about.
Okay.
But then it becomes this medium of circulation that actually facilitates the exchange of all these different commodities.
So instead of me bartering my coat for linen, I can sell my coat for money and then use that money to buy linen.
Exactly.
But money seems neutral in this process.
That's the insidious part. Money, while seemingly neutral, actually masks the social relations that are embedded within this whole system.
Okay.
It hides the labor and the power dynamics that are behind all these commodities.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together now.
Okay.
We've got commodities with their dual nature.
Yes.
We've got money facilitating exchange.
Right.
And then we've got this underlying power dynamic
Exactly.
between capitalists and workers.
You're getting it.
But how does this lead to exploitation?
Okay, so that's where surplus value comes in.
Okay.
This is really the heart of capitalist profit for Marx.
Okay.
It's the difference between the value a worker creates and the value of their labor power, which is their wages.
So if a worker creates more value in a day than what their wage is, the capitalist pockets that extra value as profit.
Precisely. And Marx gives a really clear example of this. He says, let's imagine a worker creates 3 shillings of value in 6 hours.
Okay.
But they're only paid for those 6 hours.
Right.
That extra value that they create is taken by the capitalist as profit.
Okay. That's pretty clear cut.
It is.
But how does this surplus value then fuel the expansion of the capitalist system as a whole?
So Marx argued that this surplus value is then reinvested as capital, which leads to more production, more accumulation, and further expansion of the system.
So it's like a cycle.
It is.
Driven by profit and fueled by this exploited labor.
Exactly. It's self-perpetuating.
Okay, this brings us to another element that I think is really important here.
Okay.
The division of labor.
Yes.
Marx argues that it's not just about efficiency, but it's actually about intensifying production to get the most surplus value.
Exactly.
Hold on a sec, though.
Yeah.
How does dividing labor into all these specialized tasks lead to more exploitation?
Okay, so efficiency is part of it, but Marx identifies 2 main forms of manufacture under capitalism. The first one combines different crafts into a single process.
Okay.
Think about an assembly line.
Okay.
Where each worker has one small specialized task.
Right. So instead of one artisan crafting a whole shoe, you have multiple workers each doing a specific part of the process.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, the second form breaks down a single craft into these specialized operations.
Okay.
So instead of a shoemaker doing all the steps of making a shoe, you have separate workers for cutting, stitching, attaching the soles, and so on.
Okay, I see. So what are the consequences of this type of division of labor?
Well, Marx argued that this de-skills workers.
Okay.
It alienates them from their labor.
Right.
And it makes them more dependent on the capitalist.
So the worker becomes like a cog in the machine.
Exactly.
Just repeating the same task over and over.
Right.
Never seeing the finished product.
Yeah.
And having very little control over their work.
And this alienation, as Marx called it,
Yeah.
is a key feature of capitalism for him. It separates workers from the products of their labor, from the process of production, and even from themselves.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so we're seeing how this division of labor really intensifies production.
Right.
And then that in turn leads to more surplus value being extracted.
Exactly.
But what's the bigger sociological picture here?
Okay.
We've talked about capital commodities, money surplus value, this division of labor.
Right.
How does this all fit together in Marx's framework?
So it's really important to understand that for Marx, the economy wasn't just this separate sphere of life.
Okay.
It was the foundation upon which every other social institution is built.
Okay.
So he argued that the economic base or the mode of production shapes what he called the superstructure. Things like politics, law, religion, and even culture.
So the way a society produces and distributes goods determines its beliefs, values, laws, even its art.
It's a bold claim.
It is a bold claim.
But it's absolutely central to his theory of historical materialism.
Okay.
So he saw history as this series of class struggles, each driven by these contradictions within the prevailing mode of production.
Okay, so feudalism had the conflict between lords and serfs.
Right.
And then capitalism has this clash between capitalists and workers.
Exactly.
How does this connect back to exploitation and alienation then?
Well, exploitation, remember, that's the extraction of surplus value from workers. That's the engine that's driving capitalism.
Okay.
And it creates this fundamental conflict of interest between those who own the means of production and those who have to sell their labor.
And alienation, the separation of workers from their labor and its products.
Right.
That just fuels this conflict even more.
Absolutely. It leads to this sense of powerlessness for workers while the capitalist class is accumulating all this wealth and power.
So this is why Marx saw capitalism as inherently unstable.
Exactly. He believed that the contradictions and inequalities that it produces would ultimately lead to its downfall.
Let's shift gears for a second, talk about money a little bit more.
Okay.
We touched on how it masks social relations.
Yeah.
But I'm still a little fuzzy on how that plays out in everyday life.
Okay, sure. So think about something as simple as buying a cup of coffee.
Okay.
On the surface, it seems like a very straightforward exchange, right?
Right.
Money for a good.
Yeah.
But Marx would argue that that act actually obscures a whole web of social relations and labor processes.
So it's not just about the barista handing me a latte.
Right. It's about the farmers who grew the beans,
Right.
the workers who roasted and packaged them,
Yeah.
the truck drivers who transported them, all these different people involved.
And all of the profits that are being extracted at each stage.
Exactly.
The power dynamics between like the employers and employees and even like the global trade networks that are involved.
That's connected.
And all of that is hidden behind this seemingly neutral exchange of money.
It is. Money acts like this veil, concealing the social relations and the labor that are behind the commodity.
It makes it seem like this simple transaction between individuals.
Right.
When it's actually a product of this like massively complex system.
You got it. And this is how Marx saw ideology functioning under capitalism.
Okay.
It naturalizes the existing order.
Yeah.
Makes it seem inevitable and obscures the exploitation and the power imbalances within the system.
So to really understand capitalism, you need to kind of see through this veil of money and recognize those social relations and power dynamics that it's concealing.
That's the key.
Okay, I think it's time to dig into alienation a bit more.
Okay.
Because we've kind of been dancing around it.
Yeah.
It's obviously like this central concept for Marx.
It is.
But I think it's often misunderstood.
Right. It's not just about feeling isolated or lonely.
Right.
For Marx, alienation was the structural condition that's inherent in capitalist production.
Okay.
He argued that workers are alienated in 4 distinct ways.
Okay, 4 ways. Let's break it down. What's the first one?
The first one is alienation from the product of labor.
Okay.
So workers typically don't own what they produce.
Right.
They're producing for the capitalist,
Yeah.
who owns the means of production
Right.
and then sells it for profit.
So like a worker who's assembling smartphones all day might not even be able to afford to buy one themselves.
Exactly. They're separated from the fruits of their labor.
Yeah.
The product becomes this alien object that belongs to someone else.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What's the second form of alienation?
So the second form is alienation from the process of production.
Okay.
So work in a capitalist system is often reduced to these repetitive, specialized tasks.
Right.
The worker becomes like a cog in a machine with very little control over the process or how the product is designed.
So instead of like a craft person creating a chair from start to finish,
right,
you have workers on an assembly line, each doing a small isolated task.
Exactly.
Right.
And this separation leads to meaninglessness and lack of fulfillment in work.
Yeah, you're just doing something without really understanding its place in the bigger picture.
You got it.
Okay, I'm seeing how these forms are kind of building on each other.
Right.
First, you're separated from what you produce.
Yeah.
And then you're separated from the process of producing it.
Exactly.
What's the third form?
Okay, so the third form is alienation from our species being.
Species being?
What's that? So by species being, Marx meant our essential human nature.
Okay.
He believed that humans are inherently creative and social and driven to like work and produce collaboratively.
Okay.
But capitalism, he argued, actually stifles this natural drive.
So instead of fulfilling our natural inclination to create and collaborate, we're forced into these like repetitive, alienating job.
Exactly.
That just serves someone else's profit.
Right. Our labor becomes a means to an end, which is survival, rather than an end in itself.
Okay.
So we're estranged from our true potential.
Wow, that's a really powerful insight.
It is.
And the final form of alienation.
Okay. The fourth form is alienation from other people.
Okay.
So capitalism fosters this intense competition and individualism. Right. It pits workers against each other for scarce jobs and resources.
So instead of feeling solidarity with each other, we start to see each other as rivals, as threats to our economic security.
Exactly. And this creates isolation and loneliness.
Yeah.
It erodes any sense of shared purpose.
So these 4 forms of alienation create this like deeply dehumanizing experience for workers under capitalism.
This was capitalism's ultimate failing for Marx.
Okay.
But he didn't stop at critique.
Right.
He also explored potential alternatives.
Okay.
And one of the key concepts here is class consciousness.
Class consciousness.
Okay. Now, this isn't just about knowing your class position.
Right.
It's about developing this shared understanding of capitalism's exploitative nature.
Okay.
And a collective will to actually change it.
So it's not just I'm a worker.
Right.
It's we are workers, and this system is rigged against us.
You got it. It's about recognizing that these inequalities aren't natural or inevitable.
Okay.
They're the result of historical and social conditions that can be challenged and transformed.
So how does this class consciousness like develop?
Okay, good question. So Marx argued that it arises through struggle and collective action.
Okay.
So as workers experience things like low wages, unsafe conditions, lack of control, they start to question the system.
So shared hardship and struggle lead workers to see themselves as a class united against this capitalist system.
Exactly. And through organizing, forming unions, taking collective action, this class consciousness solidifies and becomes a force for change.
But didn't Marx believe that capitalism would eventually be overthrown?
He did.
By a socialist revolution? So did he see this class consciousness as like the driving force behind that?
He believed that the contradictions inherent in capitalism would eventually create the conditions for a socialist revolution.
Okay.
But that workers needed to develop class consciousness to actually seize the moment and bring about that transformation.
So it's not just about the system collapsing.
Right.
It's about workers having the awareness and organization to create something new.
Exactly. A new, more equitable system.
So what did Marx envision for this socialist society then?
Okay.
Did he have like a detailed blueprint?
So he didn't offer a specific blueprint.
Okay.
But he outlined some broad principles based on his analysis of capitalism's flaws.
Okay.
And a key feature of this socialist society was a classless society where the means of production would be owned and controlled collectively rather than by a small elite.
So no more capitalists and workers.
Right.
No more exploitation based on like the ownership of capital.
That was the idea. A radical shift from what we're used to.
Yeah, it is.
The idea was to abolish private property in the means of production and establish a system where everyone has a stake in the ownership and control of the economy.
What else characterized this socialist vision?
So he envisioned a more democratic and egalitarian society where everyone has a voice in decision-making and resources are distributed more equitably. And very importantly, he envisioned work as fulfilling and creative, not alienating and exploitative.
No more drudgery and meaningless tasks.
Right. People would actually enjoy their work and feel ownership over what they produced. That was the goal. So by abolishing capitalism and its inherent inequalities, he believed that we could create a society that prioritizes human needs and allows individuals to reach their full potential.
That was Marx's vision.
This has been an incredibly dense exploration of Marx's sociology.
We've covered so much ground.
We have.
From his economic analysis and sociological framework to his powerful critique of alienation and this vision for a socialist alternative.
It's a lot to take in.
I mean, it's a lot to process.
It is.
But I think our Sociology Droids listeners are up for the challenge.
I think so, too.
They're probably already thinking about how these ideas apply to contemporary issues.
Oh, I'm sure.
Like, for instance, how would Marx analyze something like the gig economy?
That's a great question.
You've got these platforms like Uber and Lyft that are kind of blurring the lines between, like, employer and employee.
It really challenges that traditional capitalist model that we've been talking about. Like, is the platform itself the capitalist extracting surplus value from these workers? Or is it facilitating a more like decentralized market exchange?
Like how does exploitation even manifest in this context?
Yeah, it's a whole new set of questions.
It was like Marx's theories provide the framework, but the landscape itself has shifted.
It has.
And here's another example. You know, Marx described the industrial worker as like a cog in the machine. But what about today's knowledge worker? Who's like constantly tethered to their laptop?
Yeah, their office is everywhere.
Work and life are completely intertwined.
It really raises these questions about a new form of alienation. Not just from the product and the process of production, but almost like alienation from time itself.
You're always on.
Yeah.
And that kind of pressure can be really isolating.
It can be. And yet at the same time, these same technologies that are creating this new form of alienation, they're also creating these new avenues for connection and collective action. I mean, think about the role of social media in movements like the Arab Spring or Black Lives Matter.
It's fascinating.
It is.
These platforms can facilitate solidarity, information sharing, mobilization on a scale that we've never seen before.
Exactly. It's almost like a digital expression of that class consciousness that we were talking about earlier.
And it transcends geographical boundaries.
It does.
So while work and communication have obviously evolved in ways that Marx could never have foreseen, his core ideas about power inequality and collective action, they remain strikingly relevant.
They do.
And I think that's the power of studying sociological theory.
I agree.
It gives us these tools to analyze the world around us. But the real work is applying those tools to this complex and ever-changing world.
That's where the rubber meets the road.
It is. Well, Sociology Droids listeners. Keep those analytical gears turning.
Keep thinking.
As you delve deeper into Marx, consider how his ideas illuminate our current social landscape.
Absolutely.
We've just scratched the surface here.
We have.
But hopefully this deep dive has sparked some insightful connections for you.
I hope so.
That's all for today's exploration of Karl Marx.
Okay.
We'll catch you on the next episode of Sociology Droids.